November 20th, 1994. A beautiful fall day in Northern Virginia. The weather is typical for late autumn. The leaves have turned colors. There is a chill in the air that suggests winter is coming. In the Springfield neighborhood of Fairfax County, families are going about their lives. People are at work. Children are at school. The world turns as it always does. But in one home on Reseca Lane, a terrible violence is about to occur. A young woman is about to be murdered. A child is about to become an orphan. A family is about to lose everything. I'm Yoonjin Lee, and this is the story of Warr Lawrence. This is the story of a horrific crime. This is the story of a mystery that lasted 29 years. This is the story of how justice, when it finally came, arrived in a way no one could have predicted. Warr Lawrence was 37 years old. She was a mother. She was a wife. She was an employee at a tire company. She was living a life. She had goals. She had dreams. She had a future that should have stretched ahead for decades. But on that November day in 1994, all of that was taken from her by violence. For 29 years, her family didn't know who had done this. For 29 years, the killer walked free. For 29 years, Robin's case remained an unsolved mystery. A cold case gathering dust in police files, a crime that seemed destined to remain forever hidden. But in 2023, everything changed. DNA evidence from 1994, blood left on a washcloth, was analyzed using cutting-edge genetic genealogy technology. The killer's identity was finally revealed, and in a twist that stunned investigators, the killer called the police and confessed. This is the story of Warr Lawrence. This is the story of how a beautiful fall morning became a nightmare. This is the story of how justice, delayed by 29 years, finally came through the power of modern science and the voluntary confession of a man who had been living a lie. Do you believe that no crime is ever truly forgotten? Do you believe that DNA can solve what seemed unsolvable? What would you do if you suddenly realized that you had committed a crime 29 years ago and that the police had finally found you? If you want to discover how DNA genealogy is revolutionizing cold case investigations, if you want to explore the stories of victims whose names almost faded from history, please subscribe and turn on your notifications. We tell the stories that seem destined to remain unsolved. We remember the victims that society almost forgot. We investigate the mysteries that prove that time cannot erase the truth. Let's find the truth together. Northern Virginia in 1994 was a growing suburban area. The Washington, D.C. metropolitan area was expanding outward, and communities like Springfield and Fairfax County were becoming more populated. They were becoming more developed. They were becoming bedroom communities for people who worked in Washington. It was the kind of place where people believed they lived in relative safety. The neighborhoods were suburban. The homes were nice. The families were stable. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed unlikely. It was the kind of place where people didn't expect their neighbors to be murderers. Warr Lawrence had moved to this community with her husband, Ollie Lawrence. They had built a life together. They had a young daughter. They had a home. They had normalcy. Ollie Lawrence worked in a profession that required him to travel. On November 20th, 1994, he was out of the country on business. His wife and daughter were home alone. It was the kind of morning that should have been ordinary. Robin was going about her day. She was at home. She was living her life. She had no idea what was about to happen. She had no idea that a violent predator was about to intrude into her home. She had no idea that this would be the last morning of her life. Her daughter, only 2 years old, was playing in another room. She was safe. She was innocent. She had no idea what was about to happen to her mother. Around 12:30 p.m., violence erupted. Warr Lawrence was 37 years old in 1994. She was born in New York. She had moved to Virginia to build a life with her husband. She worked in the promotions division at a tire and auto center. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest work. It was work that allowed her to support her family. She was a mother. She had a 2-year-old daughter. She was devoted to her child. She was building a life as a parent, trying to provide stability, trying to give her daughter the love and support she needed to grow. She was a wife. She and her husband Ollie had built a life together. They had created a home. They had created a future. They had dreams of what their life together could be. She was living in a suburban neighborhood in Northern Virginia. She was trying to build something meaningful. She was trying to live a normal, quiet life. She was not wealthy. She was not famous. She was not someone whose name would normally appear in the news. She was an ordinary woman, living an ordinary life. But on November 20th, 1994, her ordinary life ended in extraordinary violence. She did not deserve what was about to happen to her. She had done nothing to provoke her attacker. She was simply a woman going about her day in her own home, the place where she should have felt most safe. She would be murdered by a stranger. She would be stabbed repeatedly. She would be left dead in her own home, and her 2-year-old daughter would be left alone, wandering the house, surrounded by her mother's blood. On November 20th, 1994, a home invasion occurred at the residence on Reseca Lane in Springfield, Virginia. The details are horrifying. The violence was extreme. The brutality was incomprehensible. Warr Lawrence was stabbed. She was stabbed repeatedly. She was stabbed 49 times. That is not hyperbole. That is not exaggeration. She was stabbed 49 times. The attack was not quick. The attack was not merciful. It was a prolonged assault. It was a violent rage. It was a predator committing an act of unspeakable violence against a woman he had never met, a woman who had done nothing to him, a woman he seemed to have chosen at random. The autopsy would later reveal the devastation. The pathologist found massive trauma. The violence was so extreme that it was almost impossible to comprehend that a human being could inflict such damage on another human being. But she also fought. Evidence suggested that she resisted. She tried to defend herself. She tried to protect herself, but she was overcome by someone stronger, someone filled with rage, someone who was determined to inflict violence. During the assault, blood was left on a washcloth in the bathroom. This blood-stained washcloth would contain the killer's DNA. This evidence would sit in storage for 29 years, waiting for the technology to catch up. Robin's 2-year-old daughter was in another room. Somehow, the child was not harmed. Somehow, the child survived the horror that was happening in the next room. The child wandered the house after the violence, surrounded by the aftermath, not understanding what had happened, not understanding that her mother was dead. When Ollie Lawrence couldn't reach his wife by phone, he grew concerned. His wife should have been home. She should have answered her phone. Something was wrong. He asked a family friend to go check on her. The family friend arrived at the home. The family friend opened the door. The family friend discovered the horrific scene. Warr Lawrence was dead. She was lying in her home, stabbed to death, surrounded by blood. Her 2-year-old daughter was found alone in another room. The police were called immediately. Police responded to the scene on November 20th, 1994. Detectives arrived. Crime scene specialists began their work. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. An autopsy was scheduled. The initial investigation was extensive. Police interviewed neighbors. Police searched for witnesses. Police looked for any clue that might point to the perpetrator. A DNA profile was developed from the blood on the washcloth. This was 1994, and DNA technology was still relatively primitive. The O.J. Simpson trial had not yet occurred. DNA analysis was new. DNA databases were not as sophisticated as they would become. But the investigators did their job. They collected the blood-stained washcloth. They sent it to the lab. They had a DNA profile developed. They ran the profile through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders. But there was no match. The killer, whoever he was, had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require his DNA to be submitted to the system. So the investigation hit a wall. There were no suspects. There were no obvious leads. The killing seemed random. The victim seemed to have been chosen arbitrarily. There was nothing to suggest a connection between the victim and the perpetrator. The police did what they could. They interviewed people. They followed leads. They pursued every angle. But as weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the case gradually went cold. Robin's case became another unsolved murder, another file in the ever-growing stack of mysteries without resolution. Years turned into decades. 1994 became 1995. 1995 became the 1990s. The 1990s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. The 2010s became the 2020s. For 29 years, Robin Warr Lawrence's case remained unsolved. Her family grieved. Her husband was devastated by the loss of his wife. Her daughter grew up without her mother. She grew up not knowing who had killed her mother. She grew up wondering about the woman she barely remembered. She grew up carrying the trauma of that day when she was 2 years old, though she could not consciously remember it. Every year on the anniversary of Robin's death, the family grieved anew. Every birthday that came and went reminded them of how old Robin would have been if she were still alive. Every holiday was painful. Every celebration was incomplete without her. The investigators who had worked on the case eventually retired or moved to other assignments. The case file was stored. The evidence was maintained, but the active investigation was essentially dormant. The crime scene photograph, the bloodied washcloth, was preserved. The DNA was preserved, but there was nothing to do with it. The technology didn't exist to use it. The DNA database searches had turned up nothing. The case remained cold. Ollie Lawrence, Robin's husband, lived with the pain of his wife's murder. He lived with the questions that seemed impossible to answer. After all this time, you maintain hope, yet you also question. Will they genuinely find someone after 29 years? He later told a reporter. That question, will they ever find someone, hung over the family for 29 years. But technology was advancing, and someone was about to answer that question. In 2020, decades after Robin Warr Lawrence was murdered, something changed. The Fairfax County Police Department established a cold case unit. This unit was dedicated to revisiting old, unsolved homicides. The cold case unit looked at many cases, including Robin Warr Lawrence's murder. The investigators in the cold case unit reviewed the evidence from 1994. They looked at the DNA profile that had been developed in 1994. They recognized that new technology had been developed since that time. They recognized that DNA genealogy, a revolutionary new investigative technique, might be able to solve a case where traditional DNA matching had failed. They decided to submit Robin's DNA evidence to Parabon Nanolabs, a DNA technology company in Northern Virginia that specializes in genetic genealogy and DNA phenotyping. This company had the expertise and the technology to use DNA evidence to identify suspects, even when those suspects had never submitted their DNA to law enforcement databases. Here is how it works. Investigators submit DNA from a crime scene. The company uses that DNA to identify biological relatives of the suspect through genealogy databases. They then research the family tree to identify potential suspects, people who would have been the right age and in the right place at the right time to commit the crime. It is an astonishing technique, and it has solved hundreds of cold cases across the country. Parabon Nanolabs began working on Robin's case in 2020. They analyzed the DNA. They searched genealogical databases. They attempted to identify biological relatives of the killer, but the case seemed hopeless. Parabon gave a solvability rate of 0 to the case. The database matches were too distant. The genetic information was too vague. It seemed like this case would never be solved through genetic genealogy. But someone decided to try anyway. A volunteer with the Fairfax County Police Department Cold Case Unit decided to continue the genetic genealogy research, despite Parabon's assessment that the case was unsolvable. Her name was Liz, and she asked that her last name not be used for privacy reasons. She was a volunteer researcher who worked with the Cold Case Unit. She was dedicated to solving cold cases. She was determined to find answers for victims' families. Liz began researching the DNA genealogy connections. She looked at the distant relatives identified through Parabon's analysis. She traced family trees. She followed genealogical connections. She attempted to work backward from the identified relatives to identify a primary suspect. It was tedious work. It was frustrating work. It was work that seemed like it might never produce results. I was ready to give up a number of times, Liz later said. But I kept thinking, well, I'll just finish this, or just do this one more thing. That determination, just one more thing, kept her going. 3 years of research, 3 years of following genealogical connections, 3 years of building family trees, 3 years of investigating potential suspects, and finally, after 3 years of work, Liz identified someone. His name was Stephen Smirk. Stephen Smirk was born around 1966. In 1994, when Robin Warr Lawrence was murdered, Smirk would have been around 26 or 27 years old. He was the right age. He had been living in Northern Virginia in 1994, stationed at Fort Myer as an active-duty Army member. He was in the right place. Liz found photographs of Smirk. She found a high school yearbook picture from 1988. She found a DMV picture from 1998. She found photographs of this man and compared them to the digital composite sketch that Parabon Nanolabs had created based on DNA phenotyping, the process of predicting physical appearance from DNA. The resemblance was striking. The man in the photographs looked like the composite sketch. The timing was right. The location was right. Liz believed she had found the killer. She presented her findings to the Fairfax County Police Department Cold Case Unit. Detectives Melissa Wallace and John Long reviewed Liz's research. They were skeptical. Stephen Smirk had no criminal record. He had never been arrested. He had no history of violence. He was working as a software engineer, a respectable profession. He lived in Niskayuna, New York. He seemed like an ordinary person. I wasn't very hopeful at the time, Detective Wallace later recalled. I was just looking at this guy's background. I'm thinking, there is no way. But the detectives decided to pursue it anyway. They decided to travel to New York. They decided to approach Smirk and request his DNA. On September 7th, 2023, nearly 29 years after Robin Warr Lawrence was murdered, Detectives Wallace and Long arrived at Stephen Smirk's home in Niskayuna, New York. They found him outside, taking out the trash. He comes to the door right away, Wallace said. All we said is we are detectives from Fairfax County, Virginia, and we're looking into a cold case from the 90s. Smirk's reaction was, according to the detectives, stone-faced. He showed no apparent emotion. He showed no apparent concern. But when the detectives asked if he would voluntarily provide a DNA sample, he agreed. He allowed them to collect a sample from him. The detectives collected the DNA. They gave Smirk their contact information. They told him they would be in touch. Then they left. The detectives returned to their hotel. They waited for the DNA results. While they were in their hotel, Detective Melissa Wallace received a call. It was Stephen Smirk. I want to talk, and I want to talk right now, Smirk said, according to police reports. Detective Wallace was shocked. She was freaking out, she later recalled. She ran to her partner's room. I run down to Long's room while I'm still on the phone, and I'm banging on his door, and he comes to the door like, "What is the problem?" I'm like, "We got to go to the police department," Wallace said. But before they could arrange to meet with Smirk, he took another step. He called the local police department. He turned himself in. He went to the Niskayuna Police Department and asked to speak with police. When detectives spoke with him, Smirk provided a full confession. He admitted that he had murdered Robin Warr Lawrence on November 20th, 1994. He described his involvement in the crime. He talked about what he had done. He provided details about the murder. Police Chief Kevin Davis described it this way. He fully described his involvement. It is beyond involvement. He talked about killing Robin, and he talked a little bit about some more details that I won't go into, but it was a full confession. And it was a confession with more than enough details. After 29 years of mystery, after 29 years of not knowing who had murdered Robin, the truth was finally revealed, and the revelation came from the killer's own mouth. The confession was detailed and incriminating, but the evidence was also overwhelming. The DNA that had been collected from the blood-stained washcloth in 1994 was compared to Smirk's DNA collected in 2023. It was a perfect match. The DNA from Robin's murder scene matched the DNA from Stephen Smirk's body. There was no doubt. There was no ambiguity. The science was conclusive. The composite sketch created by Parabon Nanolabs based on DNA phenotyping matched Smirk's appearance from photographs taken in 1988 and 1998. The genealogical research conducted by volunteer Liz had correctly identified him. The timeline was correct. Smirk had been on active duty in the Army, stationed at Fort Myer in Northern Virginia in November 1994. He was in the right place at the right time. Police Chief Kevin Davis emphasized that the strength of this case is overwhelming, and we feel fully comfortable that he's going to be successfully prosecuted right here in Fairfax County. Smirk was charged with second-degree murder. He was extradited from New York to Virginia. He was held in custody awaiting trial. In 2024, Stephen Smirk pleaded guilty to the murder. He was sentenced to life in prison in March 2025. For 29 years, the case had been cold. For 29 years, the family had waited. But finally, justice was served. When Stephen Smirk confessed, he provided some insight into why he had murdered Warr Lawrence. He said that he had chosen her seemingly at random. He had not known her. He had no connection to her. She was simply an attractive young woman that he had decided to attack. But in the aftermath of his confession, in conversations with investigators and mental health professionals, Smirk made a startling admission. He suggested that if it had not been for his family, if he had not had a wife and children to anchor him to a normal life, he might have become a serial killer. His violent impulses might have led to multiple murders. He might have killed again. It was a chilling admission. It was an acknowledgement that his violent nature could have resulted in multiple victims if circumstances had been different. But he did not kill again. After murdering Warr Lawrence in 1994, Smirk apparently did not commit any other violent crimes. He moved to New York. He built a life. He married. He had children. He worked as a software engineer. He lived an apparently normal life. But the violent act of 1994 remained hidden for 29 years. And when finally confronted with irrefutable DNA evidence, Smirk chose to confess rather than fight the charges. For Robin's family, the confession brought a complicated mixture of emotions. There was relief. There was the knowledge that her killer had been identified and caught. There was the satisfaction that justice had been served, even though it had taken 29 years. But there was also lingering pain. There was the knowledge that Robin's life had been stolen. There was the knowledge that she had suffered horribly in her final moments. There was the knowledge that her 2-year-old daughter had grown up without her mother because of one man's violent rage. The family's statement emphasized their gratitude to law enforcement. We, as the family who's sitting here to my left, would like to thank the Fairfax and Niskayuna police departments for their work on this case. But they also carried the weight of nearly 3 decades of not knowing, of waiting, of hoping that someday justice would come. Finally, it had. If Robin could speak, what would she say? Perhaps she would say, "Thank you for not forgetting me. Thank you for pursuing justice, even though it took 29 years. Thank you for using every tool available to find the truth." Perhaps she would say, "The weight was unbearable for my family. My daughter grew up without me. My husband lived for nearly 3 decades with unanswered questions." But justice finally came, and perhaps that provides some measure of peace. Perhaps she would say, "Don't give up on cold cases. Don't believe that some murders will remain forever unsolved. The truth is always there, waiting to be discovered. It just sometimes takes time, and it takes people with dedication and determination." What do you think about Robin's case? What do you think about genetic genealogy and how it solves cold cases? What do you think about the fact that Smirk confessed? If you have thoughts, please share them in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to telling the stories of victims like Warr Lawrence, the stories of women whose lives were stolen by violence, the stories of families that waited decades for answers. We believe that no victim should be forgotten. No case should remain cold forever. No killer should escape justice indefinitely. This is Yoonjin Lee, and this has been the story of Warr Lawrence, a woman whose murder was finally solved through the power of modern DNA science and genetic genealogy. 29 years after she was killed in her home in Springfield, Virginia. Thank you for remembering her name. Thank you for believing that justice matters, no matter how long it takes.